From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome to all of you today. It's nice to have you here with us. I'm Robert Saladini from the Kluge Center, and I've asked Chris Murphy, who is head of the Near East section of the African and Middle Eastern Division here at the Library of Congress, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Karen A. Leal. Chris?
Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon and welcome. As Robert said, I'm Chris Murphy, head of the Near East section of the library's African and Middle Eastern Division, and it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce today's speaker. The Near East section, as are all sections in the African and Middle Eastern Division, is pleased that over the past few years it has been able to work closely with the scholars resident at the Kluge Center. A number of years ago, I was fortunate to be privy to a conversation between Dr. Billington, the Librarian of Congress, and Dr. George Attia, then head of the Near East section. At that time, Dr. Billington expressed his desire to create here at the library a center that would serve two purposes. First, the librarian wanted the center to bring senior scholars who would in a number of ways make their knowledge and experience available and useful to the library and to Congress, which it serves. Secondly, Dr. Billington wanted to bring to the library young scholars who had recently completed their doctoral studies. The purpose of this effort is to make sure that scholars at the beginning of their careers learn about the Library of Congress and its unparalleled collections. That end has been well served by the several Kluge scholars who have worked in the African Middle Eastern Division reading room, including today's presenter, Karen Leal. Karen was educated at Harvard, completing her dissertation in 2003. Subsequently, she received a postdoctoral award at the Packard Humanity Center. Following that, Karen was assistant professor at St. John's University in New York, where she was made a research fellow at the Vincentian Center for Church and Society, while also serving as an advisor for the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See at the United Nations. Since 2008, she has been managing editor of the highly respected journal Muqarnas, an annual on the visual cultures of the Islamic world. Karen's research interests have focused on perception of minorities within the Ottoman Empire, and her Kluge project examines Ottoman understanding of the empire's classical heritage. Without further ado, Karen.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. And I'd like to take a moment just to thank everyone at the Kluge Center, Dr. Brown, and all the staff have been so welcoming and helpful to me in the few short months that I've been here. And also I'd like to thank the staff at the African and Middle Eastern Division and in the MAP Division for all their helpful suggestions. Now, the Ottoman Empire at its height stretched over 3 continents and included Anatolia, southeastern Europe, North Africa, Syria, Arabia, and Iraq. It stretched from the Straits of Gibraltar in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east, from Slovakia in the north to the Yemen in the south. In the 14th century, though, it was just one of many Muslim emirates that had found a place in Anatolia between the Orthodox Christian Byzantine Empire on one side and the Muslim Seljuk Sultanate on the other. The Ottomans flourished in the northwest corner of Anatolia in the Marmara region, along the frontiers with the Byzantine Empire. And indeed, this location and their close involvement with various Byzantine political factions gave them a distinct advantage over their rival emirates. In 1453, the Ottomans took the Red Apple, the city of Constantinople, which also came to be known by the name Istanbul, itself a corruption of the Greek phrase Eastine Polen, to the city. This signaled the end of the Byzantine Empire. Upon news of this event, Pope Pius II is said to have remarked, "Now we have really been struck in Europe, that is, at home." The Ottomans had been moving westward long before 1453. They first crossed over into Thrace in 1354 after a fortuitous earthquake destroyed Byzantine fortifications at Gallipoli, and from there they eventually entered Bulgaria. After that, they continued to expand westward and eastward in a very symmetrical pattern, with the vision of ruling an intercontinental empire. Although this plan was temporarily checked by Tamerlane, who considered the Ottomans his disobedient vassals, the Ottomans recovered relatively quickly and continued to threaten Europe militarily for the next 3 centuries. By the 15th century, the Ottomans had conquered much of the area that we associate with classical Greece. They took Thessaloniki in 1430, Athens in 1459, and the southern Morea, that is the Peloponnese, in 1460. In 1481, they briefly occupied Otranto in Italy. The Red Apple was now Old Rome, and they twice reached the gates of Vienna in 1529 and in 1683. Mothers in Vienna used to scold disobedient children by telling them that the Turks, as they were called in Europe, would come to get them if they misbehaved. Even after the empire ceased to pose a threat militarily, it continued to be a key player in European politics and diplomacy until its demise in 1923, when Mustafa Kemal Atatürk founded the Republic of Turkey. When Mehmed the Conqueror entered Constantinople, he claimed for himself the title Kayseri Diyari Rum, Caesar of the lands of Rum, meaning Rome. It is true that the Ottomans saw themselves as Ghazi warriors for the faith, but they also saw themselves as the successors to the Second Roman, that is Byzantine Empire. When the Emperor Constantine moved his capital to the east in 324, he called it New Rome, though it subsequently became known as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Most of the subjects in this new Ottoman Empire had looked upon themselves as Romaioi, Romans. They were Orthodox Christians who spoke a number of languages, including Greek, Serbian, Romanian, and Bulgarian. 400 years later, the Greek nationalists became the first to carve out a nation-state from the empire. The Kingdom of Greece was created in 1832 by France, Britain, and Russia, with a Bavarian prince named Otto for a monarch. What happened in the intervening centuries has been portrayed as the Turkokratia in the nationalist historiographies of the states that succeeded the empire, a period of Turkish occupation in which the Greeks, the Serbians, the Bulgarians, the Romanians were under the Turkish yoke, enslaved and persecuted, but not intrinsically altered by Ottoman culture. At the other extreme, modern Turkish historiography has often described a multicultural utopia in which the various groups that comprise the empire were allowed a great deal of autonomy. Both of these viewpoints accept the idea that from the time of the conquest in 1453, there existed a system of millets, legally sanctioned religious communities, under the authority of the central government. According to this model, the millets were led by their respective religious leaders with little interference from the state. My research has sought the middle ground between these two extremes and questioned the validity of the millet system paradigm, which implies that the state acted as an umbrella organization over self-contained non-Muslim communities whose internal workings were not affected by Ottoman administration. In modern Turkish, millet has come to mean nation, and as a result, many have been prone to project the idea of distinct nations under Ottoman rule to earlier centuries when that sense of the term was not applicable, and when in fact that word was not even used in reference to non-Muslim groups. I argue that in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Muslim and Greek Orthodox inhabitants of Istanbul were actually becoming more alike in terms of the way they lived and conducted their daily lives. At the same time, the Greek Orthodox community, or certain members thereof, was also becoming more aware of itself as a distinct entity, distinct both from other groups that comprised the empire, as well as from the Ottoman state that granted it varying degrees of sovereignty and autonomy. Both trends existed simultaneously. A growing feeling of a group identity based on a distinct sense of a Greek heritage did not undermine the sense of being an integral part of the fabric of Ottoman society. Paradoxically, the more Greek Orthodox subjects availed themselves of Ottoman institutions such as the Imperial Divan, the more decisions rendered there created an environment that fostered a heightened sense of belonging to a distinct group. The topic of my current research project grew out of this dissertation research because as I studied the Ottoman state's internal vertical connections with its Orthodox Christian community, I saw how these were intertwined with the empire's relations with the European powers, particularly the French, the English, and the Habsburgs. In this period, we see three trends converging. Firstly, there is a major transformation in how the Ottomans administered their state, in that they begin to incorporate Greek Orthodox Christians into the government without first requiring that they convert to Islam. Secondly, there's an increasing tendency among some Europeans, primarily French and English thinkers, to define their past in relation to classical antiquity, particularly Greece. We see this, for example, in the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns that was ongoing in France in the late 17th century. We also see it in the transformation in how Greece and the Ottoman Empire are portrayed in maps by European cartographers. Indeed, this interest in geography is itself a reflection of a heightened interaction between Ottomans and Europeans, primarily in the form of French and English delegations and individuals traveling in the Ottoman lands, which very frequently included visiting the ruins of classical Greece that, of course, had been primarily under Ottoman rule for over 2 centuries. The memoirs those visitors wrote frequently became bestsellers in their home countries. In the opposite direction, in 1721, the special envoy Yirmisekiz Mehmet Çelebi arrived in Paris, and he too documented his experiences in the Fransa Sefaretnamesi, the Book of Travels of France. The confluence of these three trends created an environment in which the Greco-Roman tradition, in its archaeological and literary forms, influenced not only how certain French and English writers looked at themselves and their past as something distinct and distinctly European, but also, I would suggest, it affected the Ottoman intelligentsia as well. The Greek and Roman world that some in Europe were claiming as their peculiar cultural patrimony also played a role in the empire that many in Europe regarded as their complete antithesis. In all of this, I've been very much inspired by Franco Venturi's expansive studies of the Enlightenment. In discussing the collapse of the Ancien Regime, he says that we must look not to Paris, London, Vienna, and Berlin, but to the margins of the continent. Without looking, he says, to Sweden, to Russia, to Wallachia, to Italy, to Greece, to the Mediterranean, as much as to Paris, the great transformation of the Ottoman world in the last decades of the 18th century will be incomprehensible. In the same vein, I would like to propose that the holds that the Greco-Roman world had on certain Parisian and English men and women at the turn of the 18th century cannot be fully appreciated without consideration of the effect of that tradition in the Ottoman realm. There you have a few more maps of the Ottoman Empire. They asked us of what genos we were, our patrice, our religion, our concept of life, and our fortune. They learned that our genos was that of the Hellenes, that this city was our patrice, that our religion was that of Christ, irreproachable and pure, that our conception of life was to desire to live honestly, and that our fortune was neither outstanding nor lowly, but being such as was suitable to life. Nikolas Mavrokordatos, Grand Dragoman of the Ottoman Empire, a position akin to that of deputy foreign minister, and voivoda of the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, most likely wrote this passage in the second decade of the 18th century while being held prisoner by the Habsburgs in Transylvania. Framed in terms of a dialogue between several Greek Orthodox men and 3 European foreigners disguised as Persians, whom they happen upon near the Hippodrome, that's the Hippodrome in the 16th century, Philotheus' Diversions is an oblique commentary on Ottoman society and government. Written in an archaizing Attic Greek style, the work supplies the philosophical perspective of a member of the Greek Orthodox community who was intimately familiar with the functioning of the Ottoman bureaucracy. In 1719, this novel was presented to the French ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, the Marquis de Bonnac, as a gift for Louis XV, when preparations were being made for Yirmisekiz Mehmet Çelebi's visit to Paris. 3 terms employed in this passage Genos, nation or people, patris, homeland, and Hellenes, Hellenes, must be examined carefully in considering this dragoman voivoda's perception of his place in the Ottoman world. As with the term millet, an appreciation of the word genos has been hindered in no small part due to the way the 19th and 20th century historiography has traditionally, and in my opinion erroneously, applied the meaning it had acquired by the 1800s and retains in modern Greek today to the late 17th century context. Genos means stock, lineage, blood, as well as nation or race, as in the nation race of the Hellenes. Concepts related to nationhood underwent revolutionary transformations in the 18th and 19th centuries. By the first decade of the 1800s, race was becoming intrinsically intertwined with the concept of nation in the Western European powers' understanding of which entities were entitled to sovereignty and statehood. By this time, some Greek Orthodox of the Ottoman Empire, with European and expatriate Greek Orthodox political, financial, and intellectual support, had determined that the genos ton Hellenon, the nation or race of the Hellenes, should have its own state based largely on the presumed continuity of this genos from classical times to their own day. It is as though these European and Greek Orthodox intellectuals assumed a wholly formed, distinct community had existed for centuries under Ottoman rule, awaiting the opportunity for statehood. Yet this understanding of genos may not necessarily have been applicable to the context of the late 17th century multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire. That is simply because a word such as genos possesses a historical continuity from classical Greece to the present in that its form remains frozen. One should not assume it refers to the same concept in the 4th century BC, the 17th century, or the 19th century. The term Hellene never went completely out of use. It does appear in Byzantine texts between the 12th and 15th centuries. Nevertheless, by the Byzantine and Ottoman periods, it had acquired a pejorative connotation due to its association with paganism. The relatively rare Hellene is thus particularly striking as the primary way for a Greek Orthodox subject of the empire to identify himself to his European guests. However, it is worthwhile to remember that the revival of interest in classical Greece in Europe during the Renaissance had aroused curiosity regarding the lands now part of the Ottoman Empire, where the ruins of that civilization were located. The cosmopolitan and urbane Mavrocordatos, aware of this interest in the classical world, may have himself been affected by such an outlook, even as he imbues his characters with it as well. Despite the affinity obviously felt for Hellenic civilization, the Patris is nevertheless Istanbul. Mavrocordatos displays an affection for the city he claims as his homeland, even though this was not the geographical location where, quote, the Hellenic nation illustrated the grand glories of antiquity. The connection to ancient Greece is thus more intellectual and emotional than physical. Not many years before Mavrocordatos wrote Philotheus' Diversions, another Greek Orthodox subject of the Ottoman Empire, a member of the Bakers' Guild named Costa, who had an oven just outside of Istanbul, petitioned the imperial divan for permission to bake the fine white variety of bread consumed by the palace. His request was granted in routine bureaucratic jargon. The mundane nature of Costa's complaint regarding his business demonstrates the normalcy and standardization of certain aspects of ordinary Greek Orthodox subjects' interaction with the Ottoman bureaucracy. He took his problem to the authorities, who issued a resolution confirming their positive response to his petition. Did Costa consider himself a member of the genos ton Hellenon? He most likely referred to himself as Romaios, as did the state, which increasingly used the term Rum in its dealings with Greek Orthodox in this period. Another unrelated petition to the imperial divan reveals a source of friction between Muslim and Christian residents in an Istanbul neighborhood. A group of Muslims complained that because of the debauchery and rowdy behavior emanating from local taverns, they were being disturbed as they prayed in the mosque. In that case, the divan prohibited the selling of alcohol near the mosque. While the judgment rendered in this situation may not have been remarkable, it can nevertheless be inferred from this document that taverns had obviously been allowed to proliferate in an area near a mosque, a process that must have taken at least several months or years to develop, with the Ottoman state's ignorance or quiet acquiescence until a complaint was made. This attitude and the Divan's response was merely in keeping with the pattern of the Ottoman administrative tradition. The government did nothing to stem a situation such as the opening of taverns until it was brought to the attention of the Divan by the offended representatives of the government of the neighborhood. Ottoman documents, such as the one concerning Costa the baker, reveal that Greek Orthodox Christians would petition the empire about problems unrelated to their religion, even as certain aspects of their way of life, such as tavern keeping, could also prove to be a source of discord for at least some of the Muslim subjects with whom they interacted, and sometimes lived in close proximity. The languages in which Mavrocordatos' work and the decrees of the imperial divan were written highlight the particular ties that bound the Ottoman state to its Orthodox Christian subjects. The Greek script in which Mavrocordatos wrote was for all intents and purposes the same one used by major prose writers and poets of the 5th and 4th century BC Athens, Thucydides, Aeschylus, and so forth. The accent marks, rough breedings, and iota subscripts back there, were inserted according to the same rules instituted by the Alexandrian scholars of the 3rd century to ensure that the word's then current pronunciation would not be lost. These accent marks were maintained throughout the Byzantine period, even after they had become ossified artifacts, no longer reflective of the living language's inevitable evolution in pronunciation and vocabulary. This similarity between the Greek used by certain Orthodox Christians in the empire and that of the ancients was not lost on French and English visitors enamored of the classical past, who wrote about how mystified they were at how different present users of that script seemed to be from what they must have imagined classical Greek speakers of, shall we say, 5th century Athens to have been. Yet the author of Philotheus' Diversions, who used the term Hellene to describe his yenos to a foreigner, was also a member of the Ottoman bureaucracy, well versed in the Ottoman language in which decrees such as those regarding the Baker Costa and the wine taverns were composed. Mavrocordatos was a leading member of Costa's Rum community, part of the Greek-speaking Orthodox elite known as the Phanariots, named for the Phanar district of Istanbul where they resided and where the Patriarchate was located. The rise to prominence of the Phanariots was related to a major shift in how the Ottoman state conducted its diplomatic relations. In 1683, the Ottomans had besieged Vienna, and many in Italy still feared that the Ottomans aimed to conquer Rome. But by 1699, they were compelled to sign the Treaty of Karlowitz, in which they formally acknowledged the loss of various territories to the Habsburgs, Venice, and Russia. Nicholas Mavrocordatos' father represented the Ottomans at those negotiations. The Phanariot dragomans, frequently educated abroad and fluent in European languages. In fact, dragoman, as in Grand Dragoman, comes from terjuman, which means translator. They would be crucial, these Phanariots, for managing the new international dynamic. It was in these years that we see a marked increase in the number of travelers from France, especially coming to the Ottoman Empire. Even before Karlowitz, men such as Jacob Spon, a French doctor with an interest in ancient numismatics, visited the Greek monuments and was among the first to use the term archaeologia to describe what he was doing, as well as archaeography, he says as well. In the early 18th century, Joseph Piton de Tournefort, a botanist and general scientist, and Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, were among those who wrote about their fascination with the classical ruins they encountered. De Tournefort remarked that, "I look at the brain of these poor Greeks as I would at living inscriptions, which serve to conserve for us the names cited by Theophrastus and Dioscorides. The present-day Greek Orthodox were regarded as descendants in whom remnants of the past might be discerned upon careful observation." The anthropologist Michael Hertzfeld has noted how, quote, "Greece may be unique in the degree to which the country as a whole has been forced to play the contrasted roles of Europa and humiliated Oriental vassal at the same time. Indeed, by the 19th century, Greece had come to be perceived both spatially and temporally, that is, geographically and historically, the two being intricately bound to one another. Spatially, Greece was conceived as being between East and West, simultaneously both and neither European and Oriental. Temporally, Greece was the heir of the civilization that formed the basis of European thought. Modern Greeks were the descendants of the ancients, to whom the moderns compared and contrasted themselves. The two dichotomies do not correspond to one another. Rather, ancient and modern are two related aspects of being European, while the East-West contrast highlights Greece's supposed foreignness. Greece was thus simultaneously the cradle of Western civilization, that is, ancient European, with the potential to become modern European, but only if it could overcome its myriad social, political, and economic problems, which were generally blamed on centuries of domination by a conquering alien Oriental, quote-unquote, empire. To a certain degree, the inhabitants of modern Greece were regarded as proto-Europeans, whom Europe was bound to protect, if only out of a somewhat condescending gratitude for the presumed contribution of classical Greece to contemporary civilization. This idea persisted into the 20th century. The best-selling History of Europe, written in the 1930s by H.A.L. Fisher, begins with the sentence, "We Europeans are the children of Hellas." And in 1981, 150 years after the founding of the Greek state, when Greece was accepted into the European Economic Community, allusion would be made in the British Parliament to the cultural debt that we all owe to a Greek heritage almost 3,000 years old. These are distinctly post-Enlightenment manifestations of the ancient modern and European Oriental dichotomies. Yet in many ways, these dichotomies were beginning to show themselves in incipient form in the 17th century, when the lines were not so sharply drawn and untransgressible. In the late 1600s, the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns broke out in the Académie Française. Of course, the revival of interest in the Greek and Roman classics had been ongoing for some time. It was one of the hallmarks of the Renaissance, and indeed the flight of Greek scholars to Italy in the wake of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople spurred on this revival. But something novel was at work in the late 1680s, when French academicians began to debate the relative merits of classical and contemporary works. The quarrel concerned the idea of progress. We see that the Greco-Roman world was implicitly being understood as a distinct and defining element of what it meant to be part of Europe. The ancients held that contemporaries should devote themselves to perfecting the imitation of classical culture, which had no rival. The moderns argued that cultures could indeed surpass their predecessors. These adversaries, whether they sided with the ancient or the modern, were considering their present in relation to a very distinct past. And indeed, in one of the maps that I consulted, you have a statement, made very unselfconsciously that all known civilizations in the world are contained within the Ottoman realm. While the quarrel started in Paris, it quickly spread to other parts of the continent and was satirized by Jonathan Swift as the Battle of the Books. I think that the opening up of the Ottoman Empire, now no longer a military threat, and of the classical sites over which they had sovereignty, was part of this new heightened interest in thinking about Europe's relation with its classical past. Of course, Rome had always been accessible, but that was a living city, constantly evolving. I think that the chance to visit ruins left to decay enhanced the sense of wonder about the differences between ancient and modern. Now, normally, I would have continued now by discussing some of these different texts with you, but in the map division here, I found a slew of interesting European maps that I wanted to share with you a bit, just because I think they highlight some of these ideas about how ancient and modern were affecting Europe at the time, and also implicitly the Ottoman realm as well. Researchers such as David Livingston and Charles Withers have observed that maps not only conveyed pictorially the encyclopedic knowledge of the Earth being accumulated at the time, but also became a medium through which archived information served to project a wide range of interests embodied in the parchment itself. With respect to depictions of the Ottoman world, Palmyra Brummett has noted how early modern maps of Ottoman domains tended to, quote, interweave various layers of historical time and memory, as they appealed to a number of audiences that she says included statesmen, armchair travelers, map collectors, and a literate or semi-literate public. As such, these maps tended to portray not distinct regions with defined borders, but religious, military, and cultural dimensions. And of course, the classical world would be an inherent part of such expressions. Now, I've only just begun to consider European cartography's depictions of Greece and the Ottoman world, and I haven't even had a chance yet to look at Ottoman representations. But I wanted to present you with some of my preliminary observations. In maps from the 16th and early 17th centuries, you tended to have this part of the world depicted primarily in terms of their classical names. You know, as you see, Hellas in Greek, as well as Greece. And if you could see it closer, it's in terms of the Latin names, but Aegeum for Aegean Sea, and Adriaticum, and the Euxine, the Black Sea. This was, of course, based on the Ptolemaic vision of the world. And I think it was partly this depiction done because there was so little familiarity with this region at the time. But it was also, I think, a way to deny the military threat that the Ottomans posed at the time by refusing to even name provide the Ottoman names.
Is this Dutch, French, what?
This one is an English map. I'm sorry, I left my notes on it behind, but it's either an English or French map from 1626. It may be Sanson. Mm-hmm. Palmyra Brummett has alluded to the way in which these areas were also very often shown as socially empty, without any representations of the people who lived there. Moreover, when people were depicted in these maps, the Ottomans were again frequently omitted. So I'm sorry, this map was so big, we could only take two sides of it to show you the images that are depicted. And this one is English, again from 1626. And you see on the left-hand side, you have depictions of a Grecian, an Egyptian, an Assyrian, an Arabian, and a Persian. And then on the other side, their wives. But no Turks, or no mention of Ottoman at all. In fact, you hardly ever see the word Ottoman mentioned in these maps. Occasionally in some of the French maps, they'll say Othman, O-T-H-M-A-N. Also, with respect to these areas, the regions that were significant to Christians were highlighted as well. This is the whole map shows the entire empire, but on the bottom you have a depiction of Jerusalem, which was, of course, sacred to both Orthodox Christians and Christians in Europe, in Western Europe as well. And what's also interesting about that is that in 1721, when that delegation was going to Paris, the kind of the pretext was to grant permission to the French to make repairs on the Holy Sepulchre. But it was really kind of a reconnaissance mission for the Ottomans. At the turn of the 18th century, you also find maps that highlight ancient and modern. And I think this is a trend that must have been influenced by the great culture war that was being debated across Europe at the time. And it, of course, shows a greater familiarity with the contemporary Ottoman and Greek names for different areas that travelers such as Spone and de Tournefort would have encountered. But it also serves to underscore that distinction between ancient and modern, and perhaps makes the viewer think more carefully about how he or she identified as a modern while viewing those places that were part of the ancient world and about which he or she might have read in the original Greek. And you have on the left-hand side, again, delineations of the ancient names and also of the 6 sanjaks into which Greece was divided, the 6 kind of administrative units into which Greece was divided at the time. By the end of the 17th century, when I think not coincidentally, the Ottomans no longer posed a threat and had indeed lost territories to the Russians, Venetians, and Habsburgs, you do see European cartographers increasingly using the designations Turkey in Europe and Turkey in Asia as they begin to specify the Ottomans' presence in their portrayals of the region. But at the same time, the reason that I chose this image to be juxtaposed with the title of my talk was because I think you see it, all of these concepts coming together, how much of an overlap there is between what Turkey is, what Europe is, and what Greece is at this time. And even though at the same time, I think these designations make it seem as though somehow Turkey in Europe is temporary, that they won't always be in Europe. But that's something I have to think more about looking at these maps. And finally, though, I would like to show you a cartouche from a map from 1723 up on the left-hand side there, which I think, again, embodies all of these ideas that were kind of percolating in Europe by this time about the relations between Greece and Europe, whatever that entity of Europe meant at that time, and what the Ottoman role was. So you have this turbaned figure brandishing his sword over these cowering and weeping, kind of glistening Greek statues with all of these shards of pottery and ruins about. And I think this one, again, Turkey in Europe, is a bit of wishful thinking, where you have this figure. He looks kind of like a Roman to me, but I guess he could be a Greek hoplite, stabbing these turbaned figures on the ground. But I don't know what the angel is for. Yet, looking at these maps, we also have to consider, I think, how sovereign powers may themselves be influenced by the histories of the places over which they rule. So, with respect to the Ottomans, I would say that in one sense, they had staked a claim to the Roman past when they took Constantinople in 1453, and Mehmet the Conqueror took the title Kayseri Rum. And indeed, they partook of a Roman Rumi heritage filtered through the Byzantine Empire as inhabitants of Anatolia, a region characterized by the mélange that included other Muslim emirates, Orthodox Christians, Sufi mystics, Armenians, Muslim scholars, and others who resided there in the 14th and 15th centuries. But I think by the 18th century, this idea of Rum was a bit of a vestigial memory, particularly in this time when the term was being specifically applied to the Greek Orthodox community in Ottoman bureaucratic registers. Yet one leading member of this Rum community would argue that the Ottomans shared in the Hellenic past. That was our Grand Dragoman Nicholas Mavrocordatos, whose work Philotheus' Diversions afforded the author the opportunity to dispel prejudices Europeans may harbor towards the empire. While describing Ottoman culture and society, the narrator comments that it is, quote, necessary to cast off the precarious opinion of those who think that the Ottoman nation, to Ottomani Hongenos, is devoid of elegance and nobility. It's argued that the Ottomans are the true heirs of antiquity, but that, quote, due to the scarcity of the modern's books and ignorance of the most reliable philosophy based on the senses, they do not know about nature and the secrets of chemistry which enrich life, and instead are led astray by and engage in dubious activities such as alchemy. The Grand Dragoman thus placed himself in the midst of the quarrel, firmly it would seem on the side of the moderns, even as he called himself a Hellene. Indeed, according to the narrator, the keynote of Ottoman character exudes Hellenic cleverness. It is lack of familiarity with recent advances in the sciences, not their nature, that impedes the Ottomans. In Mavrocordatos' worldview, the Ottoman and Hellenic Yeni are intimately connected since they are both descendants of classical civilization, even though one now has sovereignty over the other. However, the type of sovereignty the Ottoman state exercises allows the Hellenic Yenos to maintain its distinctive identity within the empire. This, I would argue, is a result of the unusual ties that bind the two Yeni together. Though Mavrocordatos never articulates it in this fashion, the link connecting these two communities was the Phanariot aristocracy, of which he himself was a member. His interpretation of Yenos allows members of that aristocracy to be proud of and justify their role as modern descendants of classical civilization, even as they simultaneously cultivate an Ottoman identity as well. Now, my next step in this project is to examine the works of Ottomans writing in Ottoman Turkish to understand how they were relating the contemporary world to the classical past. And what I've begun to analyze here at the library is a book by the 17th century Ottoman geographer Katip Çelebi called the Cihanuma, Book of the World View, which was published by the Müteferrika printing press in 1732. And just yesterday I found a statement that just looking through the first few pages of this that I think is very telling and could yield something eventually. And in this statement, he's saying that I think it's a Quranic saying because it was in Arabic and I needed help with which the staff there very nicely provided with the Arabic. This Quranic saying, observe the effects of God's power on the earth, prompted him to study books of the science of geography. And he was also prompted, he says, by the Christians, Nusara, like Nazarenes, who had investigated these works already and had learned so much from the Greeks. And the term that he uses for Greek is Yunan, which is the Turkish for Ionian, which is what the modern state of Greece in Turkish is Yunanistan. But it harks back to that classical past as opposed to a term like Rum, which has that Christian element kind of interwoven with it. So that awareness of the Greek world and how the Ottomans might appropriate it is what fascinates me. The same writer also had a Christian convert to Islam help him translate the Atlas Minor of Mercator and Hondius from Latin into Ottoman Turkish under the title Levami al-Nur fi Zulmat Atlas Minor, Flashes of Light in the Darkness. Another work that I'm hoping to look at is the History of Athens by an Ottoman judge known as the Qadi of Thebes, who utilized Greek, Latin, and French sources to trace the development of the city from the classical period to his own age. And another work, finally, is A History of Rome by Hezarfen Hüseyin Efendi, who was kind of contemporary with Katip Çelebi, late second half of the 17th century. I hope that one day soon I might be able to report back to you my findings on how the tradition of Greek antiquity that many in Paris and London were coming to see as their unique cultural heritage was also being discussed and debated in another European state that held sovereignty over those coveted classical remains. Thank you.
Okay, we now have a very few moments for questions, and Karen will take her own questions.
Yes?
You talked about the maps and some of them portraying what appeared to be non-recognition of the Ottomans. Can you talk about the power aspect of those centuries? Who were supporters of the Ottomans, whether it was through trade or some other power structure that might have been in place at that time with other countries outside of that?
In the 16th century especially, it's much to the chagrin of a lot of the other European powers. France was particularly intent on establishing close relations with the Ottomans. I'm not sure, considering maps is really something new to me. I'm much more used to dealing with texts, but I'm not sure how that would have been reflected in terms of map making at the time.
Why would
But
France be interested in having a relationship with the Ottomans?
partly for you have to think of the Ottomans as a European, playing a role in European politics as well now. So in terms of the Habsburgs, to form different alliances with, this was something that upset the Pope a lot at the time, how France could possibly ally itself in some way with the Ottomans, but it kind of formed a very important relationship there quite early on. But again, I'm not sure how that would be reflected in the maps at the time.
I'm not really specifically concerned about the map, I'm using it as an example.
Right.
Specific about the history of the Ottoman relationship between Europe and anything else in the world in regards to, it seems like everybody was against the Ottomans, and then after World War I, it was split up for obvious reasons, and that's more of a religious aspect of it, leading up to that point, as you mentioned about the Pope and...
You mean the Pope in the 15th century?
Correct.
Well, actually, the reason that I really liked that quote from him is I was doing some research on when you first start to get an idea of Europeans thinking of themselves as Europeans, that they'll identify that themselves in those terms. And there's an article by Peter Burke where he says, very often you see it used when there's a threat of an invasion. And the first time when you see it used with any great frequency is around the 15th century. And this Pope Pius II, he also, I think, referred to himself as a European. So when he says, we in Europe have been struck, that's really, I was wondering whether that's really, the first inklings of that sense that somehow Europe is a distinct element in some way. But I don't think in terms of that idea of Europe that you really see it forming until the 18th century. And even then, people will still identify themselves with the particular little region that they come from, right? So, but yeah, no, I mean, you definitely have to think of the Ottomans as a European, power player in the 16th century. Yes?
This is related to the previous question about the maps. The idea that, as you mentioned, that Turkey is in Europe, but not of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested whether you are looking at how the Ottoman Empire is orientalized and racialized, and thereby seen very specifically as an interloper within the territory of Europe. You mentioned Swift and contemporary debates, but there's also, as you know, a contemporary debate about Turkish membership of the European Union.
Right.
And the unease and the direct opposition to that might trace back to it. But are you looking at the orientalization, the racialization of these aliens within?
That's definitely, I guess, an implicit part of the project. It's not something, because I think of that as something more that's coming out in the 19th century, and I've really been focusing more on earlier centuries. But I think it's important to see all of these dichotomies that are so set by the 19th century. And, there's this idea that the Ottomans are Oriental, when, you see the main part of, the most important part of the empire for a very long time was Rumelia, that part that, today is the Balkans. And so I think looking back to that earlier era to see when those ideas are first formed, because it all ties in with, this idea of what Europe is. And that's forming at the time that I think in reaction to these dichotomies. But I haven't specifically thought of this in terms of those later 19th century manifestations, other than in terms of looking backwards to see when they form. Yes?
The element of pressure on what became Europe also came through Al-Andalus, and I'm wondering if the differences between the culture in Spain, the Moorish culture in Spain, and that of the farther east put a pinch, a squeeze on the western part of Europe, and that was happening at a time when there wasn't really anything called Europe yet.
Right.
Now, do you come across a difference within the larger Muslim world between what was going on in Spain and what was going on in Constantinople, let's say, or some of the caliphates?
I haven't considered that aspect of it yet. I think I have to, think of it in terms of that kind of pressure. Although by the time, of course, that the Ottomans were, that all of these ideas were coming to the fore, that pressure from the other side wasn't really there anymore. So I don't really think you can see it so much as being pinched on both sides, but definitely I think that memory on the European side, is very vivid, and perhaps all of that still has a bearing on these issues of Turkey entering the European Union today. Maybe they're again just vestigial memories, but they're long lasting. Yes?
Well, to follow up on that gentleman's comment, with the 1492 expulsion of
Right.
Jews from Iberia, from the Iberian Peninsula, and linguistically, Judeo-Spanish, which had a primary base in Istanbul, I'm wondering if maybe looking to the Jewish community that was in Istanbul, again, a different religion in a Muslim empire, but that exhibited religious tolerance towards Christians and Jews, if perhaps maybe material from that community might also help to portray or give a more complete image of how the Ottoman Empire saw itself,
They-
or the Lets, as you mentioned.
Jews actually filled a lot of the same role that Greeks had at the turn of the 18th century. That was really kind of a Jewish purview in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. And they get replaced, there are a number of different things that are going on, but one big problem was there was this big messianic movement in the 17th century, Sabbatai Zevi, who really had a big influence on the Jewish community, and I think that engendered a lot of distrust among the Ottomans about continuing to use them as an element. And of course there were many other trends going on at the same time. But yeah, it's kind of the same dynamic in the 16th century, and then it gets kind of placed onto the Greeks in terms of using them as dragomans and that kind of, and the wealth that they had, that they brought to the empire. The same thing with the Greeks, being merchants and kind of trading on that Black Sea littoral that kind of comes in the 17th century, the way it was for the Jews earlier on. But it's definitely a valid comparison.
Okay, there being no other questions, I want to thank you all for your attendance, and again to thank Karen.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.